In the tough times, Trump goes it alone. Washington, his staff hollowing out and his agenda languishing, President Donald Trump is increasingly flying solo, always improvisational. The president exercised his penchant for going it alone in a big way this week, first, by ordering sweeping tariffs opposed by foreign allies and by many in his own party, then hours later daring the stunning news that he'll meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, an on-the-spot decision with global ramifications. Trump's agreement to sit down with Kim came after a meeting with the South Korean delegation and took some of his top aides by surprise. The president has long considered himself his own best consultant, saying during the presidential campaign, "I'm speaking with myself, number one, because I have a very good brain and I've said a lot of things." Trump has told confidants recently that he wants to be less reliant on his staff, believing they often give bad advice, and that he plans to follow his own instincts, which he credits with his stunning election, according to two people who requested anonymity because they were not authorized to speak about private conversations. California gunman and veteran center killings was ex-patient Yountville, California. 3 women who devoted their lives to helping traumatized veterans were killed by a patient who had been kicked out of their Northern California treatment program, authorities and a relative of the victim said. A day-long siege at the Pathway home ended Friday evening with the discovery of 4 bodies, including the gunman. He is identified as Albert Wong, 36, a former Army rifleman who served a year in Afghanistan in 2011 to 2012. Investigators were still trying to determine when and why Wong killed 2 executives and a psychologist at the Pathway home, a nonprofit post-traumatic stress disorder program at the Veterans Home of California Yountville in the Napa Valley wine country region. It was far too early to say if they were chosen at random because investigators had not yet determined a motive, California Highway Patrol Assistant Chief Chris Childs said. Jerry Brown ordered flags flown at half-staff at the Capitol in memory of the victims. They were identified as the Pathway Home Executive Director Christine Lober, 48, Clinical Director Jennifer Golick, 42, and Jennifer Gonzalez, 29, a clinical psychologist with the San Francisco Department of Veterans Affairs healthcare system. China silences critics of move to abolish term limits for Xi Beijing. The day China's ruling Communist Party unveiled a proposal to allow President Xi Jinping to rule indefinitely as Mao Zedong did a generation ago, Mabo was so shaken he couldn't sleep. So Ma, a renowned writer, wrote a social media post urging the party to remember the history of unchecked one-man rule that ended in catastrophe. History is regressing badly, Ma thundered in his post. As a Chinese of conscience, I cannot stay silent. Censor silenced him anyway, swiftly wiping his post from the internet. As China's rubber stamp legislature prepares to approve constitutional changes abolishing term limits for the president on Sunday, signs of dissent and biting satire have been all but snuffed out. The stifling censorship leaves intellectuals, young white-collar workers and retired veterans of past political campaigns using roundabout ways to voice their concerns. For many, it's a foreshadowing of greater political repression ahead. GOP candidate in Pennsylvania struggles with campaign basics. Greensburg, Pennsylvania. There is no sign of Republican congressional candidate Rick Saccone on Sherwood Drive. Just days before Western Pennsylvania's special election, his campaign informed some residents that he may knock on doors that morning in this critical GOP stronghold. It's almost 11 a.m., and they're still waiting. He was supposed to stop by today, 68-year-old Republican John DeBitch says, scanning the empty streets of suburban Greensburg from his front porch. It's the second time we've been avoided. DeBitch's disappointment underscores a dangerous truth for the GOP as the nation braces for the next special election of the Trump era on Tuesday. Saccone may be President Donald Trump's strong favorite in a conservative region, but he is struggling with the basics of modern-day politics. In a race that will hinge on voter turnout, the 60-year-old state lawmaker has little organization of his own, at least compared with Democrat Conor Lamb, a 33-year-old former Marine and federal prosecutor who has never before run for office. Ethiopian Israelis decry family separation as discriminatory. Jerusalem, Zemanek Bililin has not seen her sisters in more than a decade, since she immigrated to Israel from Ethiopia with part of her family. Now a 19-year-old infantry soldier in Israel's military, Lilin says she is outraged that she is fulfilling her duties as a citizen but the state is shirking its responsibility to bring her relatives to Israel. Lilin's family is one of hundreds that have been split between Israel and Ethiopia over what they say is an inconsistent immigration policy, and whose fate hinges on an Israeli government decision over whether to allow for their reunification. Ethiopians in Israel say the bitter public feud to unite with long-lost relatives has exacerbated a feeling that the state discriminates against its Ethiopian minority. "It's shocking in my opinion. They only do this to us, to our ethnicity," said Lilin. "The state should take responsibility and stop abandoning the Jews." The issue faces a critical juncture next week, when the government is tentatively scheduled to decide whether to allocate funding to bring as many as 8,000 Ethiopians to Israel to reunite with their families. Israel clandestinely airlifted thousands of Ethiopian Jews from the country in the 1980s and 90s, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to bring the ancient community to the Jewish state and help them integrate. About 140,000 Ethiopian Jews in Israel today, a small minority in a country of over 8 million. But their assimilation hasn't been smooth, with many arriving without a modern education and then falling into unemployment and poverty. Food stamp administrators worry about food box proposal. Washington, Hawaii's food stamp administrator says he was stunned when he first heard that the U.S. Agriculture Department wanted to replace some cash benefits with a pre-assembled package of shelf-stable goods. That changed quickly to frustration, befuddlement and serious concern. "This will wreak havoc on the states," said Pankaj Banat, who serves as director of Hawaii's Department of Human Services and is in charge of administering the state's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, to roughly 165,000 residents scattered across a series of islands. SNAP administrators across the country shared Banat's reservations about America's Harvest Box, pitched by USDA officials as a way to cut costs and improve efficiency. Administrators say their programs already are efficient, allowing recipients to purchase whatever foods they want directly from retailers, which benefits families, retailers and local economies. The proposal, unveiled last month in the Trump administration's 2019 budget, is part of an effort to reduce the cost of the SNAP program by roughly $213 billion over a 10-year period. Brandon Lips, administrator of the Food and Nutrition Service at USDA, said the idea was partially inspired by rapidly changing models for how people get their groceries. The USDA last year launched a pilot program that allows SNAP recipients to order provisions online using their EBT, or electronic benefit transfer, cards, which function like debit cards but can only be used to purchase groceries. Search is on for the Best Summit site for Trump, Kim Washington, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev chose Reykjavik, Iceland. Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin huddled at Yalta. Dwight Eisenhower and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev will always have Paris. So where should President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un meet up for the first face-to-face talks between a U.S. and North Korean president? The demilitarized zone between North and South Korea is one possibility. Sweden has offered to help. And there's always neutral Geneva, Switzerland. Someplace in Asia perhaps, such as Beijing, hasn't been ruled out, nor, for that matter, has a ship in international waters. The question crackled through diplomatic and government circles Friday, one day after a South Korean official announced in the dark on a White House driveway that the two heads of state who had threatened mutual obliteration for months would take a meeting. Turnbull says U.S. set to grant Australia tariff exemption. Sydney. The U.S. appeared set to grant Australia an exemption from its new tariffs on steel and aluminum imports following discussions between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Trump this week exempted Canada and Mexico from the duties, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, and said U.S. allies would have 15 days to negotiate possible exemptions. That triggered a diplomatic offensive from Australia, including a letter to Trump signed by business leaders and former Australian golfing great Greg Norman, a Trump supporter and friend. After a telephone call with Turnbull on Friday, Trump tweeted, "Spoke to PM at Turnbull Malcolm of Australia. He is committed to having a very fair and reciprocal military and trade relationship. Working very quickly on a security agreement so we don't have to impose steel or aluminum tariffs on our ally, the great nation of Australia." Soon after governor signs gun bill, NRA sues to block at Tallahassee, Florida. Weeks after their children were gunned down in the worst high school shooting since Columbine, parents of the victims stood in the Florida Capitol and watched Gov. Rick Scott sign a far-reaching bill that places new restrictions on guns. Hours later, the National Rifle Association filed a federal lawsuit to block it. The new law capped an extraordinary 3 weeks of lobbying after the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, with student survivors and grieving families working to persuade a Republican-run state government that had shunned gun control measures. Surrounded by family members of the 17 people killed in the Valentine's Day shooting, the GOP governor said the bill balances our individual rights with need for public safety. It's an example to the entire country that government can and has moved fast, said Scott, whose state has been ruled for 20 years by gun-friendly Republican lawmakers. Bubble Watch. Alabama takes another step toward the NCAA's Albany, New York. Alabama's Colin Sexton had one thing to say after another amazing performance: "Don't count us out." Those were the first words out of the star freshman's mouth on Friday after the Crimson Tide's second straight triumph in the Southeastern Conference Tournament, an 81-63 victory in the quarterfinals over 16th-ranked Auburn, the top seed. Trailing by 10 at halftime, Sexton helped make sure the Tide would roll for at least another day, most likely longer. He hit a trio of three-pointers to jumpstart the offense as Alabama stormed back with a 28-3 spurt to start the second half and outscored its arch-rival 50-22 after the break. "Coach told us just not to give up, keep playing, fight through adversity," said Sexton, who finished with 31 points a day after his court-long dash and scoop at the buzzer had given the Tide a scintillating 1-point win over Texas A&M. "We knew when we came in this tournament we had to win games, and we wanted to because we have a lot to prove. I feel like everybody counted us out." The SEC tournament has been a boon for Alabama, 19-14, which entered riding a 5-game losing streak and teetering on the brink of the NCAA tournament bubble. The Tide entered the day ranked number 46 in RPI, 6th in strength of schedule, and had 6 Quadrant 1 victories. Copyright 2018 The Associated Press. All rights reserved. This material may not be published, broadcast, rewritten or redistributed.